to that slew of acronyms that represents all the people who helped make this presentation possible. Just want to say also this. There are a number of people who think that climate change is taking a back seat to more pressing issues right now of COVID-19 and more pressing issues related to race and inequity. These things are not separate. These things are intricately related. And it is still important for us to have a major conversation about climate change, particularly as it pertains to security, but as it pertains also to issues related to the pandemic and issues related to inequity and race. So General Cheney, we couldn't be more thrilled to have you here today, and thank you for being here. And we're looking forward to a presentation and a great Q&A.
Well, thank you, John. Appreciate that. I'll go ahead and start. Are we ready?
Okay, good. We were going to talk about your background.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, all right. Let me introduce our speaker, General Stephen Cheney. He is the president of the American Security Project. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and has over 30 years of experience as a Marine. He was a military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, where he is a member, and he was also a member of the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board and the Department of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. He's been on the American Security Project's Board of Directors since 2006 and served as their CEO from 2011 to 2019. So with that, I'll turn the screen over to you, General.
Well, Lori, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Oftentimes when I'm speaking in person with a live audience, I like to use some call it a Churchill quote, that since the speed of light travels faster than the speed of sound, some people appear bright until you hear them speak. And I usually say, I hope I don't prove that true. But I'm not sure the electrons work in this way, so I'll skip that particular joke. But let me start off by saying thank you, John, and thank you, Laurie, for your sponsorship, and certainly thank Arizona Forward and EDF, and of course, Alex, who's our climate director at ASP, who helps put these together for me. I'm very grateful to her as well. Let me start by giving a little background about the American Security Project. Founded in 2006 by 4 senators, Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman, 2 Republican, 2 Democrat, and it follows the 2004 election. In that, then Senator Kerry was not particularly pleased with the outcome of the election, but he was really upset that whenever he brought up specific topics like climate change and some with nuclear nonproliferation, he immediately got painted as the left-wing liberal that he is, and immediately turned off the audience and they wouldn't listen to him. So the thought was, if he could get a Republican, at the time it was Hagel and Warren Rudman, together, they could start a 501c3 nonprofit and then bring in what we call flag officers, that's admirals and generals, recently retired 3- and 4-star, put them on the board and let them be the spokesman and spokeswoman in one of our cases for climate change and the impact on national security. And that has worked over the years. And in fact, we've still got several of those original members are still on our board, to include Admiral Fox Fallon, who was the combatant commander for Pacific Command and Central Command, General Lester Lyles, the former Vice Chief of the Air Force, Lieutenant General Dan Chrisman, former Superintendent of West Point, are still on the board. And then we've got several others that we've added on over the period of time. Our work at ASP is varied. It's not just climate change, nuclear nonproliferation, which now is becoming a very hot topic with China and certainly with Iran and North Korea, counterterrorism, energy security, and of course, today's topic, climate security. And that's been one of our founding pillars since 2006. We, since then, have had what we call the National Climate Security Tour. And on that tour, we brought in a group called the Consensus for American Security. So if I could go to the next slide. What we thought was that the 8 or so that we had on the board originally was not enough. And that we needed others, not just retired military, but we could also take ambassadors, senior executive service folks, big policymakers, big names, that would also be associated with us, that we could tap and use them nationwide and in some cases worldwide to speak this specific issue. And we've been to Arizona, by the way, several times. I was there a couple of years ago. In fact, the last time ASP was there was November of 2019. The consensus works on a number of issues that affect our national security, and those include terrorism, American economic competitiveness. We're big trade proponents, public diplomacy, and national security strategy. And we also work on defense and foreign policy. And we like to think that we do a lot of work on Capitol Hill that has influence on the legislative side into whatever administration that's in power at the time. Let's go to the next slide. I am not a scientist. Now, we do happen to have a scientist on our consensus. It's Admiral Dave Titley, who was the Navy's chief meteorologist for several years. He's now working at Penn State University. And Dave's a unique man because he originally was somewhat of a denier on climate change. As a meteorologist, of course, he really studied the science, and he has totally flipped now. And we use this figure 97% of climate scientists agree with the basic facts. So I am not going to argue the science side of it. If you want to do that side, there's enough on our website and other websites that can talk about that. And in cases, when you look at it, the deniers, so to speak, you will see on cable television or those who are trying to make a particular issue about it. Let's go to the next slide. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, who stood up on the floor of the Senate and brought in a snowball from that day's snowfall. It was February a couple of years back, and said, this is climate change. It's snowing outside, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, that was very anecdotal. What we have seen today, of course, we are just having unprecedented heating going on in the country and in the world. And you don't have to take my word for it. Those of you that are in Arizona certainly understand it. A couple of weeks ago, the National Weather Service in Phoenix recorded the 21st day this year when temperatures were 112 degrees or above. It broke a decade-long record that you had, and I was talking with John earlier. He's got much more up-to-date statistics for this. Just in the last year, there were 13 days where the temperatures reached or exceeded 112 degrees. The summer, which is coming to a close here, is shaping up to be Arizona's hottest since records were kept. And Lori and I were talking earlier, but I do think this is a trend, and it's just continued to get hotter unless we do something about it. And this is happening because of climate change. Just some more statistics. Arizona is the 4th fastest warming state in the country. Phoenix is the 2nd fastest warming city in the United States. And then Phoenix is predicted to experience 147 days above 105 degrees by 2050, 147 days a year. Currently experiences 121 days above 105. By 2100, summers in Phoenix are going to be like the summers in Kuwait. And I've been to Kuwait in the summer, and trust me, you don't want to be there. We all know that extreme heat just means more money spent on cooling and energy bills. It certainly impacts the energy supply. Arizona's utility regulator is very concerned about blackouts, rolling blackouts that they're now having in California, of course, and blackouts can certainly be deadly in times of extreme heat. It's not just the heat aspect of it. There's several others that impact you as well. Extreme drought now, that we've seen droughts, not just here in the United States, but worldwide, and I can talk about that in some depth. The mountains that feed the Colorado River snowpack has decreased significantly since the 1950s, and it's led to decreases in water flow downstream. Of course, that's you. Lower levels of water in the Colorado River and Lake Mead means obviously less water for your Arizona farmers and ranchers. And it's reported that the lower levels at Lake Mead require water cutbacks, both in Arizona and New Mexico. By 2050, 30 years away, gang, severity of widespread summer drought is going to triple in Arizona. Coupled with extreme drought now, of course, you've seen it in California, is wildfires. In Arizona, fire crews are battling 3 large fires right now in the White Mountains. They've closed major highways. And, you know, California is really the poster child for the fires, as we've all seen. They've got several fires that have burned areas 3 times the size of Los Angeles, already killed 7 people. So let me shift a little bit here and try to relate this to climate security risks and how that impacts the military side and national security side. Extreme heat, drought, wildfires, they all affect the day-to-day lives of Arizonans and Arizona businesses. Climate change really impacts military training readiness in Arizona. Extreme heat is going to limit the amount of time a person can spend outside. This has got certainly security implications for Arizona's military bases, to include Luke, Davis-Monthan, and Fort Huachuca, the Goldwater Range, and Yuma Marine Corps Air Base. And I will tell you, as a former commander of a major Marine Corps base, we always put health and safety at number 1. We're going to protect the troops first. And we've always had a good paradigm across all the services for looking at what the temperature and the wet bulb globe temperature was going to be, and when we would take troops out of training to get them out of the heat. So whenever the temperatures reached 90 or above, the military would call it a black flag day. When what that meant was you literally would raise a flag, a black one, and it meant that all outdoor physical training and strenuous exercise would stop. And you can imagine what that does for all the services. Now, of course, I mentioned earlier, Phoenix had 21 days this summer above 112 or above. So undeniably, those were black flag days that troops aren't going to do outside training once it hit that particular temperature. Let me talk now a little bit about heat stroke and heat exhaustion. A joint report from NBC News and Inside Climate News had 1,766 cases of heat stroke or heat exhaustion among active duty service members in 2008. Let's move a decade forward into 2018. That figure had climbed to 2,792, which is a 60% increase in just a decade. And I can tell you that number is continuing to go up. My Marine Corps, my beloved Marine Corps, the rate of heat stroke has more than doubled over that specific period. It's really posed a huge risk. Certainly the health impacts are impacting us. Some estimates are that it's costing the military nearly $1 billion in between that decade just because of heat stroke and heat exhaustion. Getting to the more tactical side of it, extreme heat means in some cases it's too hot to fly. And certainly you can see that at the air bases in Arizona. Higher temperatures, when you have higher humidity, they make it harder for the planes to take off, and they can't train. What happens here is the heat creates thinner air, which means it doesn't have the necessary density to give the plane enough lift to take off, or land for that matter. And the heat limits its ability to climb. The heavier the aircraft, the more trouble it is. And so now what you have to do, you've got to either ground the aircraft or lessen the load that the aircraft has, or not do training at all. So you are going to see this more frequently, particularly at all your air bases that you have in Arizona. Let me shift for just a second and talk about water. You know, when temperature rises, the water becomes certainly more precious, and drought threatens water resources for bases, certainly, and the surrounding community. You couple that with wildfire, and you've really got a problem. And I can tell you, after my many tours at Camp Pendleton in California, wildfires or fires in the field were nothing new. But what is new is how plentiful they are now and how they are impacting training. But to give you an example, in 2016, they had a huge fire near Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, 10,000 acres plus, closed the southern portion of the base and stopped the satellite launch. So now I'm going to shift into the catastrophic weather side of the house. So in addition to the heat, drought, wildfires, all the military bases are facing increased flooding, worsening storms, and sea level rise. And I've got a lot of personal experience on this particular side of it. Several examples: extreme flooding at Nebraska's Offutt Air Force Base in 2019. It caused $420 million in damage to that particular base. And now, of course, we've got catastrophic weather occurring at a much more frequent basis and much larger. Worsening storms, hurricanes are really causing great damage. And I've made several tours through North Carolina during a trip there in May of 2019. I went to Camp Lejeune, which is one of our largest Marine Corps bases in the country. And I saw the damage that was caused by Hurricane Florence the year before. Amazing that they had $3.6 billion worth of damage caused at Camp Lejeune and the adjacent Marine Corps Air Station at New River and the Air Station at Cherry Point. So much so to the extent that the Commandant at the time, General Bob Neller, they had to curtail or stop several training exercises and stop many deployments that were going on at the particular time. Let me shift a little bit more to the south and look at Tyndall Air Force Base, which Hurricane Michael basically devastated. You see it in this particular picture. It wiped out the entire base. It was a major F-22 training base for the Air Force. They had to move all the F-22s to other bases and stations. Some expect that it'll take a decade for that to recover, if not more. Going to cost $3 billion plus. As a consequence, the Air Force had to consider grounding combat aircraft, defer 61 facility repairs, and cut flying hours for non-deploying squadrons. All of this affects the readiness of the United States military. And lastly, on this side, I'm going to talk about the Navy. The Navy's not exempt from this. Their biggest threat is sea level rise. And the biggest base, naval base in the world, Norfolk, is the one that is most threatened. And you think the Navy wouldn't have a problem with more water, but they do. And what happens is when that water rises in conjunction with catastrophic weather, but certainly sea level rise, which is caused by climate change and the melting of the Arctic, the piers get inundated. And now they are having to replace all the piers at the Norfolk Naval Base. It's turned into a huge problem with that. In addition, the base gets flooded frequently. And when the base gets flooded, the sailors can't get to the ships. And you talk about a deployment problem, they've got it in spades. All these examples that I'm listing are on ASP's website, militaryresilience.org. You can see examples on there, and we've got a lot of papers that are written specifically about them. So that's a lot of that. What I'm talking about is more on what I call the tactical side. I'm going to go more now and broaden it and talk about the strategic side and go overseas and talk about what we're seen happen in places overseas that are causing us to deploy more frequently. Obviously, we know the U.S. has a great interest in a stable and predictable world. We're not big fans of civil unrest. We know there's going to be ethnic strife, fragile governments, and a lot of failing ecosystems. We know that climate change in and of itself is not the cause of these conflicts, but it exacerbates the existing problems, such as water availability, food production, migration, overpopulation, economic insecurity. All of them have the potential to make conflict much, much more likely. As we all know, weak states may become failed states, and a lot of societies are not able to cope with these sudden shocks, to include drought and hurricanes or long-term stresses like decreased agricultural yields. Some didn't understand that a lot of the cause of the original Syrian conflict was movement out from the agricultural areas because of the longest drought in their history from 2007, 2011, basically caused their agriculture to dry up and everybody moved to the cities. And of course, then that helped fuel the conflict with ISIS, certainly, and no doubt about it, with the government of Syria. Certainly climate change is creating new missions for the United States military. And another example is with the melting of the Arctic, the Navy's having to have more patrols up through the clearing of the Northwest Passage. And we are woefully unprepared for that. We have, right now, because one of our icebreakers is broken down, we only have one icebreaker left. If there's any daylight on this specific issue, it's that the current administration is proposed funding for 2 more icebreakers, although ASP has recommended 6, but we've got a long way to go in terms of the Arctic. You know, one of the lines I like to use is that climate change is an accelerant of instability and a threat multiplier. And I'm going to give you a couple of more examples of this overseas. I'll start with South Asia. Long been considered strategically important to the United States, even more so now when you look at the rivalry between us and China. You know, there's a lot of tension out in that area on the ethnic and religious side of the house, but they're all vulnerable to climate-induced risks. You know, the South Asia is home to the headwaters of 6 major Asian rivers: the Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salween, and Mekong. And with the Himalayas starting to melt at a much more rapid rate, and then you have changing monsoon patterns, food and water security is becoming a much more important an issue to more than a billion people in South Asia. And one of the problems with this, of course, is China has control over the source of most of these major rivers, and it can extend its influence over the region when it has that control. And we also know as this increases, the climate risk increase, it's going to destabilize the entire area. And the world's largest democracy, which is India, is going to have increasing problems every day. Even today, I saw another case where India's got another part of the conflict with China and the Kashmir. And I'm going to mention another one that's not brought up often, and that's South America. You know, South America is a region that suffers from fragile governments, a lot of unrest, increasingly vulnerable to climate change. People don't mention it much, but you know, climate change and the loss of crops and crop yield is driving a lot of the migration through Central and South America. And it's creating a lot more destabilization than you would have thought. And that just invites other countries, particularly Russia and China, into their area to either provide support or put in their military forces. So I'm going to shift and say, okay, what are we going to do about this? What's the military solution? And it's called risk management. And all the military services are really good about risk management, and certainly all the combatant commands are. They have a J5 plan section that does nothing but 24/7 plan for every contingency. They assess the threats, and then they recommend action against all those threats. And every aspect that you have of national security is about managing that specific risk. So even if you choose not to believe that human activity contributes to climate change, we can't wait until there's 100% certainty. We have to do something about climate change. We're not going to wait till it inundates us. And certainly the military understands this, although given certain administrations, it's waxed and wanes in its importance, and whether it's written into the national security strategy or in the case of Congress, the National Defense Authorization Act. You know, we do need decisive action to reduce carbon emissions and build greater resiliency to reduce this risk. You know, given the direct threats to base infrastructure and more broadly national security, the military is taking some action. Congress and DoD have been working to make military installations much more resilient in the face of worsening storms and flooding and rising sea levels. I'll give you another example. I was the commanding general at Parris Island. We've been threatened by several hurricanes, had a Category 5 come close in 1999 when I was there. Hurricane Floyd missed us, but they're now budgeting to put a complete seawall all the way around Parris Island. And that's what we call adaptation. They've got to adapt. Of course, long term, we'd rather have mitigation, which is eliminate climate change as it is and eliminate CO2 in the atmosphere. There are other ways we're looking to produce energy within the Department of Defense. In April 2018, Vandenberg Air Force Base in California announced completion of an entirely new array of solar system, which will provide 35% of the base's energy. The Army has a program called Net Zero, where they're trying to get all their major bases to have renewable energy sources on their bases and stations. So they're understanding the advantages both to solar and to wind, and what that would help save in terms of the military. I will tell you that DoD is the #1 consumer of fossil fuels in this country, given the thousands of aircraft they have and vehicles. Long term, would they like to get off that tether of fossil fuels? Sure they would. You know, General Mattis, when he was the commanding general in Iraq of the division, 1st Marine Division, said, you know, if he could just sever that tether of fossil fuels, he would be so much better off. When I was the executive officer of an artillery battalion, my #1 concern wasn't where the enemy was or where the rounds were. It was, where's the next gas station? Because without fuel, we were not going anywhere as an artillery battalion, and we were stuck, and we were going to be a target. Which brings us to talk about battery technology. You know, I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility. In the future, you can see all our vehicles being electrical, to include Humvees and maybe even tanks. I mean, that's a stretch, but I eventually think that's what you're going to see happen. And you're going to see use of solar panels. Another example I use is the forward operating base in Afghanistan, where the young Lance Corporal up on the base to power all electronics has to haul up diesel fuel every day to power them. Well, he's the one who said, let's get a small solar array and have renewable batteries up here, and we'll never have to haul up batteries again. And in fact, that is happening now across all the services. Wherever they can, they're going to use solar power instead of having to use fossil fuels to power all their instruments. So to cut on a much larger scale to the United States and talk about US leadership, of which has waned considerably over the last couple of years, you know, we are the 2nd largest emitter of carbon annually in the United States after China. Our per capita emissions are really actually twice China's. And what's surprising here is China is investing more in green technology and clean energy than the United States is. Now, they don't get off scot-free. They're also building coal-fired power plants at the rapid rate too, although they would dearly like to get off that as well. Another pet line of mine is President Trump said the war on coal is over, and in a way he's right. And it's over because natural gas has overtaken it as a fuel by leaps and bounds because it's all become so cheap. But we view natural gas as a bridge fuel, a bridge to renewables or non-emitting sources of power. And we are supporters, of course, hydro, and certainly we are also supporters of nuclear energy. The U.S. just has to reduce its carbon emissions. We're going to prioritize our clean energy sources and our battery technology, invest in climate resilient and zero carbon infrastructure. And I've certainly listed enough examples of all that. We really need to get back on the bandwagon. ASP was long a proponent of the Paris Accords. Of course, one of the first acts by the incumbent administration was to withdraw from that. We think it's a mistake. We ought to be in the Paris Accord, and we ought to be a signatory to it, and ought to be leading in that regard. Let me put in conclusion, our politicians and the public should really take a lesson from the military and say, hey, there's a lot of things we can be doing to get off of fossil fuels and CO2 emissions. We got to acknowledge the risk of climate change. We know they're real and they grow every day. We've got to take action. It starts at the individual level, but it goes all the way up to the national perspective. And we really cannot afford to ignore the risks of climate change. And if there's any one part of us that's threatened the most, it's our national security, and we've seen it worldwide. So I realize I've rambled here a little bit, but that's the thrust of my presentation, and I'm willing to take any questions you like. You know, clearly the current environment is pretty challenging, and it's just going to get more so. With that, I'll terminate my formal part of the pitch and turn it back over to John.
Oh, you're not going anywhere anytime soon. Thank you, General. We really appreciate it. I will not soon forget some of these phrases about the war on coal is over and that natural gas is a bridge to renewables. We're working as we speak on the t-shirt shop for the t-shirt that says "Sever the Tether" to fossil
I like
fuels.
that one too.
I like that one a lot. But you know, more. I was going to say more globally, which sounds wrong, but more higher level. You're talking about the threat that climate change is to national security and the forcer that we've already seen climate change be for global instability. What do you see as major hurdles to making progress that is embraced by our government, that is legislation that can address these issues in a more comprehensive manner? Because right now what you're doing is you're talking about work that's being done by the military, quite frankly, first for the military and then ultimately for security. But how do we figure out how to enact legislation as a nation?
Yeah, John, those are great questions. And we ASP doesn't brag necessarily. We're not a lobbying organization per se, although we do have a 501c4 that can do a little bit more lobbying than we are allowed to do by law. So we spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill talking about these specific issues. And I've testified on both the House and Senate side many, many times on this issue. I'll start by educating the people on the Hill. Well, first off, educating the general public, and then educating the folks on the Hill, the impacts and the advantages of trying to counter the CO2 emissions and what goes into climate change is number one. And, you know, from the military perspective, every congressperson you talk to, senator or congresswoman or man, wants to protect the base that's in their district. But I'll give you an example. At Parris Island, where I lived in a historic old quarters one, right next door was a huge oil-fired power plant. And to get the oil to the plant, they brought it in by barge, by the way. Now, that was a backup power plant because we usually use the local grid for power at Parris Island. But the interesting part about it is Parris Island is undoubtedly an island. And whenever there was a really bad thunderstorm and the power went down, we had to fire up this god-awful power plant that was next door. Well, we weren't blind to it. And since then, they've now bought a fairly significant solar array. And in a dual use capacity, they've built it underneath on top of the parking lots where the parents who come in to see graduation, it provides shade for them. And then of course it provides a pretty good source for power for the base and stations. But Parris Island's not isolated in that regard. I mean, all the bases and stations in our country and many worldwide could be going to renewables. And that's where you get Congress involved to provide the funding to be able to do that for all their bases and stations. And so they're not dependent on the local grid, they're independent of it, and plus it saves money. So that's a very, very tactical way of saying to try and get your local representative to buy into this, to say, hey, we need to be going to renewables at all your bases and stations. And then to rise it up to a much higher level. When you get somebody like General Mattis, you know, when he was Secretary of Defense, he certainly recognized and put it in the national security strategy. He mentioned climate change was a threat to the country. Of course, he's gone. And since he's gone, that's gone as well out of the national security strategy. So that needs to come back. So that's the higher level of it. But you know, it all comes back to the funding perspective and looking at the Hill. But I think they're all starting to recognize and come around to it and understand the advantages of renewables, of course, and then you get into the decreasing of CO2 emissions, which is a little bit outside the military side of it, because even though the DoD is the #1 consumer of fossil fuels, we're only about 1 or 2% in the country. So there are a lot of other people that are doing emissions here that need to be limited. And Congress needs to understand that and needs to recognize and subsidize renewables. So it's a much bigger issue. I think it hinges on education. It starts at the top, but it starts at the bottom too. And I'll close on this one. We've traveled, Lord knows, Alex, I'm guessing 30 or 40 cities at least over the last 5 or 6 years. And it's just seemed to me that the mayors certainly got this issue a lot better than those inside the Beltway did. And these are and I say it because there's where the rubber meets the road. I mean, look at Phoenix.
Yep.
Hey, you guys are living it every day. So that's another part of it here, to have you tell your representatives on the Hill, certainly, and certainly tell the executive department, hey, we're feeling the effects of this and we have to fix it. Long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, there's no doubt that our local officials feel it and are trying to respond to it. There's absolutely no question about that. I think one of the fascinating things about ASP in general, and frankly, talking directly to a brigadier general right now, is the messenger matters. When Lori read off your bio, I did not recall anything about being arrested for being chained to a tree. You are in fact part of the American power structure. And this is different than some other climate advocates, folks who are advocating for climate change. How can you use the power of your position to get these changes made, whether they're incremental changes or large-scale changes? That is a key question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, John, it is a key question, and I don't mean to denigrate Greenpeace or the Sierra Club. But they often get associated with rather radical left-wing proposals and ramming of ships and that kind of stuff. We are not for that. Don't get me wrong. The basic premise, of course, is eliminating CO2 emissions. We understand, but we tend to take a more practical perspective on this and try where we can to take the politics out of it. And say, okay, here's where you're being impacted. Your daily life is being affected by this. And we can prove it. We can show it to you. And again, I'm preaching to the choir when I talk to folks in Phoenix. But nonetheless, you're right. The messenger plays a part in this. And that was part of the founding aspect between ASP. And that's why then Senators Kerry and Hagel said, okay, Hagel being a Republican, Kerry being a Democrat. Of course, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then, but we try to keep the politic folks out of it. It's not a Republican or a Democrat issue. It's a national security issue, and it's not going away. I am involved with a number of international groups, by the way, who have similar problems in their specific countries, particularly in Europe, who address it from their perspective, and they're doing the same thing. They're going back to their military guys and gals and say, okay, can you talk about this issue and try to get our politicians out of it? And they've had limited success. I think we're doing a little bit better with it here in the United States.
Thank you. So also you talked quite a bit about, and you gave me this very vivid picture of where's the nearest gas station when you're in an FOB or wherever you are out in the world. A question came up in the chat box about this idea of, well, not just fuel, but what about water quantity? I mean, we were just talking about how water is what forced migration in Syria. Water has to affect the military as well. How do you deal with that aspect of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to live without water, that's for sure. And that the Middle East is very interesting from this perspective. We at ASP do work with a number of Middle Eastern countries, Qatar prominent among them, but they basically get their water from desalination and then taking salt water and converting it into fresh. And now they're using solar-powered power plants to power their desalination plants to get their water. But that said, if you don't have a water source, you're in trouble. And look at the arguments now between Ethiopia and Egypt with the dam. That if that gets cut off, you're going to see you could see a war between those two countries here. And this is a war over water, which is why I mentioned what's going on between India and China and South Asia. That water is going to become more and more and more an important aspect to quality of life, and climate change is going to drive a lot of it. If the Himalayas melt, you're going to see a lack of fresh water. Same thing with the Tigris and Euphrates in the Middle East, which is, by the way, drying up rapidly, and Iraq and Iran are going to have a big water problem, not that they don't already have immense other problems. And so there is no easy solution to this, John, that long term, the solution is, of course, stop climate change and get the weather patterns to be more regular, stop the melting of the Arctic ice cap, and it might resolve some of your water problems, even the water problems we're having here in the United States.
Bunch of questions in the chat box related to how ASP is approaching this. Climate change is big. The threats in some cases feel more existential than real, even though you can obviously point to it's already happened in Syria versus it's going to happen in Iraq or it's going to happen in China. What does, and you talked about ASP having a 501c4. So is there a platform that ASP has, and how do you prioritize what you see as being the risks and needs relative to climate change?
Yeah, I mean, on the legislative side of the House, with the Department of Defense in particular, one of the seminal documents is the National Defense Authorization Act. That's where the money comes from. Congress goes through it every year, and they are pretty good about passing it. Now, when you talk to the folks in DOD, it's only a 1 year tranche at a time, and it drives them crazy. I mean, it just drives them crazy. They say, can we not have a 5-year budget so we can plan beyond 1 year? Now, obviously, they do buy things that go out beyond 1 year. Look at an aircraft carrier or the F-35. But they would like to have a little more stability in that regard. And the same thing applies on the climate change. So working the Hill side of the House, each year we go up and we try to angle in towards the National Defense Authorization Act to use that as a lever onto the Department of Defense to include climate change and reducing CO2 emissions, dual track on that particular side of the House. A 501c3, by law, I can do up to 20% of my time on the Hill, but I have to keep pretty strict track of it. The 501c4 can do much, much more. People ask, who pays you? Well, we get funding at ASP from 3 sources. We get it from donations from folks all over the country and the world, although we have never taken United States government money, which is kind of curious, but we won't. We don't want to be indebted to any particular administration. Then we get grants from various entities. We apply for grants of institutions that are interested in climate change and want to sponsor a lot of our work. So we get it from that perspective, and then we get donations from corporate entities that are we have a business group that's ancillary to us and help provide our funding. All of this gives us a little bit of a base, at least, to take our time and go up and talk to one, Capitol Hill, and secondly, do a grassroots program, just like we're doing with talking with you in Phoenix. We think from the mayors on up is important. And then we do a worldwide program. I have been all over the place. At Berlin, Brussels. I did Berlin, Brussels, and London a couple of years ago. Had a group in Europe that wanted us to come over and do that, was interested in how we did our work. Each one of those is still the bottom line to this on this specific issue is obviously long-term, the solution is reduction in CO2 emissions. And anything, and people ask, well, which one of the ways do you support? We support them all. We are an all the above organization, whether it's solar or wind, or electrical storage. We support all of those entreaties.
Let me break in here on that one. I've had a couple of people ask questions about nuclear. So can you address that real quickly? I mean, how is that?
Nuclear is a challenging and hot topic. And everybody's familiar with the nuclear side of the house, principally because of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. When they go, oh my God, look how bad nuclear is. But when you get down to it, and we have taken very little funding, if any, from the nuclear industry, but they are not CO2 emitters. And so from that perspective, despite the drawbacks you have with the residue and what's left over, and of course the other part of it is, can that residue be used to make nuclear weapons, which we are not proponents of nuclear weapons at ASP. But as a power source, it's clean from that perspective. Mm-hmm. So it's from that perspective, if everybody went nuclear, you wouldn't have coal burning, you wouldn't have gas burning, The energy sector is responsible for a dramatic proportion of our CO2 emissions. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but I want to say it's like 30 or 40%. Boy, wouldn't it be nice to eliminate that? So, and a lot of the nuclear industry has dug its own hole. It is so expensive. We're not building any new nuclear power plants in the United States. And the ones that we were going to build became so overly expensive, it just wasn't worth it. It's the financial side of the house, and that's where the fracking and the gas and all that came in, where it's so cheap to burn gas now. We're not going to build any more nuclear power plants. If they could do it cheaper, if they could do it on a much smaller scale, we support small modular reactors.
Okay.
Hey, let's go. I think it'd be great. And if they could, we know what to do with what's left over from the nuclear fuel, spent fuel, but we just haven't had the nerve to do something about it.
So some of those things are projected to be on the horizon rather soon. Is that part of the military's analysis of how it might power itself?
It is, and they are studying small modular reactors as well. And I mentioned the bases and stations, but you could build it, and it's already in the plans. There are plans on the board to build a small modular reactor that could power a small city, for instance, and be transportable. But again, when you talk the military side of the house, are you going to take a small modular reactor and drive it around Iran or Iraq, let's say? I'm not so sure. So I mean, it's fraught with there's a lot of security questions here. But that said, who operates the majority of nuclear reactors in the country? It's the United States Navy. The Navy's got I think 80 or 90 ships and submarines that have been operating safely under nuclear power for 60, 70 years now. So, I mean, it can be done. It can be done. But a lot of people don't want to recognize that.
Yeah, one other fuel source that is being asked about in the chat box is synthetic fuels from biological sources. Arizona State University and a number of other places in Arizona have been looking at things like, hey, we can turn algae into fuel. And, a lot of other research projects are ongoing in that respect. And so folks are curious whether it's biological sources or forest residuals. We got a lot of forests to clean out, and we've got biomass as a possibility. Are any of those things in the military's consideration set?
I'm not aware of any specific ones for the Department of Defense. ASP has been involved with some of these groups on biomass and that type of regeneration, and we support it. I think it's great. You can actually, ethanol is a bit of a hot topic these days because it's subsidized, and then you grow it, and then of course you burn it. Don't get me wrong, this biomass eventually does get burned, but it's the source that makes it green. And so there's a balance. There's a balance to it. We support it. I'm not aware of any specific DoD initiatives in that regard.
Yeah, well, we're burning a lot of biomass out here in California, Arizona, as we speak. Just not the way we want to.
That's the truth.
I want to ask you a few local questions, if you don't mind. You mentioned our bases here. You mentioned Black Flag Days. Do you know, or are you aware of, or can you bring a little more texture to that for us? We've been told that potentially the Corps is reviewing key bases to prioritize them for things like mitigation and resiliency. Do you know where Arizona's bases stand and all that?
To cut to the chase here, I don't. But I will tell you, I was asked a question at a forum I was doing a couple of weeks ago about base realignment and closure, which, as I mentioned earlier, every congressman, every senator covets their military base. And I've been involved in 2 BRACs in the past, in the 80s, mid 80s and early 90s. And they were so painful. BRAC is base realignment and closure. If folks aren't familiar with it, it was passed by Congress. And what it said was, we will have a study, we'll fund it. And then when they will come up with a list of bases to be closed, bases and states to be closed, they will submit that from the Executive Department to Congress. And Congress cannot cherry pick off that list. Once it's approved, those bases are going to be closed. The first one was moderately successful. The second one, there was some cherry picking going on. It was so painful on the Hill that I just don't think there's any appetite for another BRAC. So to put your mind at ease in Arizona, I don't see any bases and station closing there anytime soon. And but let me put another caveat to this. When you look at, as I mentioned, Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, and when you looked at the damage, that base was literally wiped off the face of the earth. Not different from Homestead Air Force Base about 30 years ago, which did close. Now it's a reserve base. And then there's talk they're funding now to renew Tyndall Air Force Base, which to me is nearsighted. They're going to have another hurricane. Yep. I mean, it's just going to happen. Might not be this year, might not be next year, might not be in 20 years, but they will have another hurricane. So will Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. Air Force can move these bases and stations to a lot of places, to include Arizona, where I think your flying days are much better, weather's certainly better. But heat's a consideration. I mean, no doubt it's a consideration. What we did at Parris Island, by the way, about the heat side of the house is recognizing that in the summer you've got so many Black Flag days, you start to train at night. You know, you do your physical training at night, you do your physical training, you get them up at 3:30 or 4 in the morning, you do all your PT early. Then when it gets really hot, 11 o'clock or noon, you shut down the outside and go inside and do classroom work. I see that happening more and more, and it would happen to your air bases in Arizona as well.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff. Thank you. Appreciate that. You, sir, and your fellow ASP members are becoming military voices for climate change, for climate resilience, for climate security, for climate threats. Any advice about how we can do the same with our local Arizona military personnel? Is that a possibility to get them to engage more on local climate and resilience?
Absolutely. I will tell you, again, from my past experience as a base commander, I had a fairly close relationship with my local representative to Congress. We were just fortunate in that it was a guy named Floyd Spence, who happened to be chair of the House Armed Services Committee, which is an incredibly powerful position. And we weren't stupid. We recognized that if we talked to him and convinced him that here's what our needs are at our base, he would get it funded. So, I mean, the military is not dumb in this regard. And they've all got their legislative liaison groups that are working that. And all your base commanders here, I am sure, welcome and appreciate their congressmen, congresswomen, and senators coming to their base and seeing it and letting them know what their needs are. They lay it. I mean, they know. They got it down. I can tell you right now, I know. And they lay out those needs. That, the way it works in the services, of course, is the base commander and the certainly in the Marine Corps, the Fleet Marine Force commanders submit their needs up through their chain of command, and then the Marine Corps works up a budget and it submits it to the Joint Requirements Operations Council in the Pentagon, and it's a big process, but a good process. I mean, it works. It's proven that it works. But from your local perspective, the more they can talk to them about, i.e., having a solar array that would power all your bases, that would be a big plus. Limiting water usage, for instance, is another big plus. Although I will tell you, from a personal visit to Arizona, you're pretty good about monitoring your water sources and making sure you don't waste water. Phoenix is a prime example of how well that's been done. But I think that's, and then lastly, talking in terms of deploying units, what they can do in terms of looking long-term, what the strategic implications are of climate change. And I've addressed a lot of that here, that hey, we're having to deploy in places where we hadn't had to deploy before. And this is a consequence of climate change. Whatever they can lean on the legislative side of the house to talk about regulation and funding that would help reduce CO2, it's a big plus.
General, thank you. I want to call attention to folks. I'm sure you haven't seen it, General, but in the chat box, there are a whole bunch of reports, most of them from ASP, but I also want to mention there's an EDF extreme weather report. There's the Senate Democrats Special Committee on Climate Crisis report, the House Select Committee on Climate Crisis report, and then General, there are regional Central America, China, Arctic, and Africa reports from ASP. You want to comment just real quickly on those as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, I mean, Lori mentioned earlier the boards that I sat in at the State Department. One of them did a significant study on the Arctic, and another task force I was a member with at the Council on Foreign Relations studied the Arctic. And you can go online and pull up both of those in a heartbeat, which talked at length. I was there to represent the military side of the House and talk about the impact on the Arctic and climate change. So that has played a part in our particular feelings about this. And we just did an event in Alaska, virtually, of course, 2 weeks ago. But we've done similar reports worldwide to keep an eye on the military side of the House and how it's impacted by climate change. And there's certainly been many other topics within ASP that we've been covering recently that have become much more important. The JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, which is nuclear related, of course, the Paris Accords with climate change, and we dropped out of that, of course, also. Those types of things, we talk about those at length, so they're all important to us.
Great, thank you. Just a couple minutes left. Just want to extend our appreciation to you for everything you're doing and for being with us today. I want to ask you one last question. Close your eyes. Pretend like it's tonight and you're going to bed, or any of the nights that you were a general. There are so many things that you know that we don't. What's keeping you from falling asleep right now?
I will tell you that I think it's.
You can open your eyes now, by the way.
Yeah, I'll open them up. The politicization of all these topics just drives me crazy at the cost of our security. That people are bickering and arguing when we're losing ground here. We're not doing what we need to do, and you know, climate. I'll mention this, although we could talk a while about it. You know, COVID-19 crept up on us, but when it hit us hard and fast. You know, climate change has been creeping up on us for decades now, and we've been ringing that bell at ASP for 15 years plus. But in another 15 years, you're going to be going, uh-oh, why didn't we do something about this when we had the opportunity? And between you and me, I'm a little elder here compared to you guys, but it's not going to impact me. I'll be gone, but my grandkids are really going to be in a fix if we don't stop this, and that bothers me. I mean, and it's not one of these things you can fix overnight. It's not. There's no vaccine for it that's going to happen today, with the exception of doing away with everything that emits CO2. And you and I know that ain't going to happen. So, I mean, we've got to work on this incrementally, but we've got to raise the issue for the importance that it has. That's what keeps me awake.
Wise words. Thank you, sir. Thank you very, very much for your time today. I'm going to turn it back over to Lori. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, General, and thank you to those of you who participated today. I just wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. We have another webinar on September 30th where we will be talking about climate action from the very small business to large businesses like Wells Fargo and Swires Coca-Cola and Orkut and Winslow. So please stay tuned for more information about that. And last, our Emerging Leaders program is accepting nominations. So if you know of a great leader that you would like to nominate for this program, those nominations are due by September 9th. So again, thank you, General and ASP and the EDF for helping to support us in this, bringing this important information to our group.